I'm really pleased to be able to welcome two very impressive guests and speakers. First, I'll introduce Yuval Wollman, who is president of CyberProof, and he's also the former Director General of the Intelligence Ministry and a veteran officer in 8200. So let me hand over to you, Yuval, and I'll let you take us from there. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Howard, and thank you, CyberProof marketing team, for putting such a great SOC masterclass so far. And Asaf, thanks for joining us, Asaf Kochan. I will introduce you, and then we can start chatting about geopolitics and how it affects cybersecurity threats in the enterprise market and in other markets as well. So Asaf, until recently, probably a bit more than a year ago, you were the commander of 8200. 8200 is a brigadier general, retired brigadier general in the Israeli Defense Forces. 8200 is one of the biggest cyber SIGINT agencies in the world. It's not only a regional power, but also a global one. Maybe we'll talk about whatever you will be able to share later about collaborations with other global agencies. But 8200 is a very well-known establishment in the cybersecurity world and a powerhouse for cybersecurity innovation for the veterans coming out of that community. You've also spent some time in your more than 30-year career in the Israeli security community in other agencies, but I think that your last position was the most significant one as the head of 8200. Thank you for joining me, Asaf. Nice having you here.
Thanks, Yuval, and thanks, everyone. Pleasure.
What we wanted to talk about, both of us, is about geopolitics and how it affects cyber threats. And I think that looking in today's environment, we must start the discussion with the war in Ukraine. And you know what? Let's start with the military side. I'll take an example, and I'll try for both of us to take the discussion through geopolitics into enterprise, and maybe even end it on a positive note. We're talking about cybersecurity threats, and we should not be smiling, but there are some positive aspects, or the half full cap perspectives. But if we look at the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, on the military side, on the physical side, we're seeing things that we did not expect to happen. If we look at, for example, on NATO, and specifically in the European allies in NATO, Germany. Let's talk about Germany for a second. Germany decided, the chancellor and the leadership of Germany, to rebuild their army. We've not seen that for almost 80 years. And that is a tectonic change in how security strategy is being impacted by this war. I want to ask you, Asaf, whether we will see that happening also on the cyber dimension, because the war in Ukraine is also in cyber dimension. We will get to that shortly, but I want to open the discussion with dramatic changes in the cyber sphere that can happen following the war in Ukraine. How do you see that?
So thanks for the question, and again, pleasure being here with you. I would start with kind of a statement saying that I think that there's no state that over invested in security. Most states look backwards, and they at some points look at their investments, and they come to a conclusion that they underinvested in security as a whole. Because when you need it, you really need it, and what you do not build ahead of time, you cannot just it doesn't pop out when you need it. So that's true for what we're seeing in the physical layer. You see states flocking into NATO. States which were in NATO are historically, they made kind of the right choice, and states who invested in security and in military capabilities are much more well positioned to any kind of conflict, and in many senses they have deterrence. So much of the stuff in warfare is about deterring your enemies. Going into the cyber domain, so these principles are pretty much the same. I would say that cyber is a missing part in the Ukraine-Russian conflict. One would anticipate that the war would be much more aggressive in terms of cyber warfare. Russia is a superpower when it comes to cyber. It's not a question, it's a fact. And there are two kind of probabilities, which I believe in one, but one is that there's an undercurrent cyber warfare that we're not seeing, which is happening. And the other is that there's no real cyber warfare in kind of a massive scale, which is happening. I believe this is to be the real reality. And why this is happening in cyber warfare, first of all, in the evolution of cyber warfare, we're still in the Middle Ages. Okay, unlike defending, the actual ability to weaponize cyber capabilities can be done, but it demands heavy investments. It's complex, and whatever you don't do ahead of time as a nation, you can do in a very short period of time. So these things take time to build. Saying that, we do see nowadays states who are entangling and putting in addition to the nation state capabilities, I would say cybercrime capabilities. You do see kind of I would say collaboration between these two entities, which historically were kind of well-defined and worked separately. Some states really use it as a doctrine. Without going into names, I think you can understand what I'm talking about.
Great point, Asaf. What I want to add is that, you spoke about preparing for building the capacity, defense capacity. So the war in Ukraine actually didn't start on February 24th, 2022. It started in 2014 when the Russian armies marched into the Crimea and established its presence in the eastern parts of Ukraine. And since 2014, the Ukrainian leadership started to build its capacity on the military side, but also the cybersecurity. Many capabilities and training took place. And we've seen that in the opening of the war, how the defense did help to prevent some of the DDoS attacks and other attacks that the Russian cyber front waged on Ukrainian assets. So it's about defense capacity, but also deterrence. And we have seen at the beginning of the war some deterrence from NATO allies taking place. And we also saw for I think one of the first times, White House officials trying to make an openly, publicly statements to deter the Russian leadership from taking offensive against Western assets. We've seen the VSAT attack at the beginning, just a few days before February 24th in 2022. The targets of the VSAT attacks were not only contained within Ukraine, but also we mentioned Germany. I think 5,800 wind turbines also were hit in Germany and other parts of Central Europe. So how do you see, let me ask you that, working with senior officials in the US and other Western allies in your career, how do you see deterrence take place, whether publicly or not publicly? And whatever you can share from your past experience would be great.
So I would just comment on again, the war in Ukraine, or the conflict in Ukraine, and just give context, and then I'll come up to your kind of final question. So in order to understand what's going on right now in the world, you have to kind of look at the big picture. And the big picture started, I can go back to history, but I'm starting through COVID, and COVID really created exponential growth in virtual infrastructure, IT infrastructure, kind of pushed the world in a year and a half through a process which usually takes 2 decades. And we saw it in many aspects without going into details. What did happen in COVID is that on the physical world, there were real stress on specific sectors. It's the shipment sector, the chip industry because of the closures in Taiwan and China, energy sectors because of moving oil from place to place, and a few other kind of subsectors. And going into the conflict in Ukraine, these sectors were already under stress. And some of these sectors were put into further stress. You look at the energy sector, which was under stress, it was put into further stress because of the fact that most European countries relied on energy coming from Russia, and it was cut in a day. And they had to find substitutes, and the chip industry was also under stress. So some of these areas which were under stress and were vulnerable became targets for cyber attacks. And the context of the cyber attacks is to mount further stress and to take political price when it comes to states and rivalry in the conflict. And basically, there's two major forces here. It's the US and Russia, and China didn't kind of take a stand in this sense until lately, but there is a competition, a big overarching competition between US and China and world dominancy, and it's related to dominancy in computation. So if you have the big picture, you can understand what are the areas and what are the industries and what are the verticals which are more likely to be under stress. In terms of deterrence, this is your question. Basically, deterrence is in cyber. It's a very, very complicated question to answer. I would say, first of all, it's the way you're perceived by your adversaries. So basically, when it comes to nation states operating against nation states, one key component of deterrence is the fact that you can attribute an attack to the attacker. In most cases, it's very, very complicated to attribute attacks. If you have a strong cyber capacity on the nation state level, you have a very, very clear ability to attribute cyber attacks. And once you attribute it, you can go after the attackers in many ways, from sanctions, designations, until operational activity on their end. This would be one component. The other component is to hit or come with a counterattack on the other side. So it might be on the infrastructure which is attacking. It might be on another layer which is supporting the infrastructure, which is attacking you. In some cases, the attackers would be from private sector, but basically your ability to what we call it defend forward. Defend forward is something that private sectors cannot do, states can. So basically defending forward is to go to the adversary's area or the way the place is working geographically and hitting them there in a variety of ways, which I cannot go into details. So this would be another factor. And the third factor is also the ability to go after the infrastructure, the people who guide the cyber attackers. So it's from the highest political level to the military or intelligence level to the actual groups, sometimes military groups, sometimes civil state groups, and sometimes cybercrime groups, and identify and pinpoint the individuals and make their life miserable by designating them, preventing them from moving from place to place. Now, these people, in most cases, a lot of them are people who like to travel, who like to move in the world, and suddenly the fact that they cannot do it makes their life extremely miserable and make them think, and some of them just leave this area and move to other places. So there are extra elements, but when we combine deterrence, it would be I think these are the key factors. Sorry for the long answer.
Yeah, but because deterrence is complicated, it's also about the mental and the perception, not only the real action. And this is why it complicates the thing. I would add a fourth factor to your very interesting list: alliances. If you can align yourself with a strong power or superpower, it helps. And I want to give, earlier this week, we just seen that the NATO members ratified the acceptance of Finland, which adds another, 1,000 kilometers border of NATO with Russia. But this is on the physical level. Through the conflict, Albania, let's take Albania, for example, the Albania case, they were hit dramatically by their Iranian adversaries. What Albania did, if you remember, it was about a year ago, they reached out publicly to Israel. The prime minister or one of the leaders of Albania came to Israel to meet its peer here. I mean, in Israel, I'm not in Israel right now, but to learn more about the capabilities to align itself with a cybersecurity superpower such in Israel. So alliances and pacts is also part of that, and maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
We have some polls ready, so maybe we'll have a short pause before we move, because I want to move forward to the enterprise market and its relations. But maybe before we do that, Asaf, Howard, if we can share the first poll. Yep. Let's, dear audience, let's read it. To what extent is your industry prepared for a nation-state attack? We have, I think, less than a minute to answer that. I think that leaders, business leaders, are way more aware. There is a survey that I watched. 91% of business leaders foresee a cyber attack on their company in the next 2 years. Here we go. Somewhat prepare. Okay, this is more optimistic than I thought. I guess you're also quite surprised, Asaf, by these results. But that's good. People are getting themselves prepared. I want to share with you a data point that I got recently. 56% of security leaders meet monthly their board because of the better exposure, better understanding of those cyber risks in the business level. I'm not talking about security leaders. I'm talking about the board members and C-suite in enterprises. They are getting closer to the CISOs. More discussions, maybe even more budgets. We'll talk about budgets later because of the recession and the economic impact, but they better understand their needs and the value that cyber leaders in enterprise companies see. Based on your experience, discussions with CISOs, a discussion with business leaders, how do you see that shift following the geopolitical tectonic shifts in the enterprise market, in the industry that many of our audience are part of?
Okay. Can you just kind of clear again, just make the question more clear, because I can take it two directions and I want to understand when is more relevant.
Yeah. What are you seeing in with customers that you talk with about better understanding of the business level in those companies of the cyber risk and how it impacts the way they plan the security posture going forward? Your company is working with those CISOs, your company providing solutions to those CISOs. So how do you experience, in your company, how do you guys experience the geopolitical effect on your customer?
Okay, so now I understand, clear. So again, just to give context, and then I'll answer short context. When we speak about nation-state cyber activity, it depends what nation state and what's the doctrine and what's the mean to what end. So it's not one play game. Some states will use cyber for political disruption and to create havoc and distrust between civilians and their institutions. Some states will use cyber to bring in foreign currency as a way to generate foreign currency. Some states will use cyber predominantly for IP theft and for intellectual property gain. And some will use it for military uses, dealing with weapon systems and stuff like that. And there's an entire other domain, which is in the, we call it new media warfare. It's in the social networks and influence information warfare, which is part of cyber. So this kind of, I can go into it. I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to go back to private sector. Generally speaking, the most dangerous area in the way I see it is states which collaborate with cybercrime and basically provide an immunity to carry out cybercrime activities without being punished or indicted. In return, these cybercrime groups will need to serve these states at some point and to support kind of national missions. So they'll have their daily kind of ongoing missions, which is mainly to generate a cash flow and revenue, by stealing or extortion or all the versions of cyber criminal activity. But in some events, they will have to do some stuff for the nation which is hosting them. This is kind of the most toxic, dangerous combination which I'm seeing, and in terms of influencing private sector and enterprises. And in this sense, the geopolitical context is very relevant for security teams to first understand, in order to identify the verticals and the areas which are more vulnerable. And the second part of it is also to be able to prepare your infrastructure in a way that it's more resilient and more immune, and understand how to limit I won't say there's always a chance you'll be attacked, but to limit the chances that you won't, when a line is running after you, you don't have to be the first in the row who's running. You just don't want to be the last one, okay? And in this sense, the context of cyber stress in the world of political geopolitics is key to that. We are predominantly seeing, I would say, and here I will compliment, in addition to ransomware, which is basically encrypting and stealing information and then asking for money, this is one known form, in addition to crippling networks and taking their ability to run their activity, which for some businesses, it's a death penalty. These are, but what we're seeing now, which is on the rise, is the area which is a combination of AI, AI malware, AI practices, which are cybercrime and are accessible to cybercrime groups. If you look at GPT-4, which is kind of an advanced version of generative models, and you look at CAPTCHA, for instance, the basic CAPTCHA, when you have these letters, these new AI tools eat CAPTCHA for breakfast. They just look at it and they identify it in a second, okay? For cyber criminals, I'm just giving a very simple example to understand how the world is transitioning and moving. So yes, there is an impact.
Absolutely. I think that one of the challenges that CISOs that you and I meet is how to prioritize their resources, right? We spoke about how to communicate with the board and the decision makers to get more budgets and to explain the interaction between the cyber exposure to the business impact. But at the same time, internally, they must prioritize. You mentioned infrastructure. I think they also need to look into talent, how they manage their talent, vendors, how they collaborate with vendors to make more sense of make their budget more efficient. And this where CyberProof is coming in, and Sentra, your company, is coming in as mentors, as partners that can enable this kind of efficient prioritization. I also see a lot of planning in place. It's not only how I prioritize the resources that I have, budgets and people, but also how I build a roadmap going forward. What are the assets that I would like to protect? What are the processes that I'm taking in the digital transformation that my organization are going through? So I need to adjust my processes accordingly. How do I allocate more resources into mitigation once an attack is taking place? You mentioned ransomware as the up and coming over the past 2 years. Now we're seeing the ransomware wave coming in, and the generative AI support that. And you mentioned also the geopolitical impact on ransomware. That was, I think we're about to mention the Colonial ransomware event.
Yeah,
I want to talk about it later. Correct. But also in the geopolitical atmosphere, you mentioned sponsorship of states over cyber criminals criminal groups. We're seeing black market of this knowledge and know-how, and cyber offenders, professionals working together, collaborating even without knowing, because some states provide a network and infrastructure for those collaborations to be formed and launch attacks on enterprises on the, let's say, western side of the map. So what I want to ask you is, how do you see ransomware or other forms of attack shape in the coming, let's say, year from now, or in the next year, given that the recession will still be in place, the geopolitical tensions will still maybe even increase? You know, you mentioned earlier China and Taiwan and the tension in the Pacific. So those tensions will increase. The economic recession will not go away so fast. It will take at least a year forward, and all that will only increase the challenges that we mentioned in the CISO suite. What would you recommend a CISO do facing these challenges?
Okay, so first of all, you got it right. The attacks are, the trajectory is really clear. You know, the world computation is growing, connectivity is growing, the amount of data and sensitive data is growing. Most organizations are in the, I'm looking at big enterprises. I think most of the people on this session reflect big enterprises. So large kind of Fortune enterprises, most of them have a hybrid environment. They are on the journey to the cloud. So they have two operational environments. They have their on-prem legacy environment, in addition to kind of the new cloud environment, and their attack surface exposure is extremely hard or complicated to defend. And protecting in the cloud is very different than protecting on-prem because the way the cloud is designed, that data should move and should get to the edge and should be accessed, and it's easier to duplicate it and so ever. So in this sense, the core principles, which I will define in terms of training, are slightly different from the kind of traditional way people are looking at it. First of all, number one is actually building your team and understanding that you know, cybersecurity is not tennis. It's not a tennis game. It's a team game. It's more like football or soccer or basketball. You have players, you have a team, and the team has to play against the other team. And the way they train, the way they understand, the technique they work, in many ways will define the outcome. The second would be to invest in pre-positioning. So most organizations are heavily focused on the actual prevention, and the culture they have is that no cyber attack should happen. If you were attacked, it's a complete failure. In reality, there's 100% that you'll be attacked at some point. And if you're assuming that you won't be attacked, then this is kind of your paradigm. And once you're attacked, you see it as a failure, you're living in the wrong world. So basically the idea is to assume that you will be attacked, to play the if game, which will happen sooner rather than later, and to pre-position yourself to such attack in a way that you're able to maintain resiliency, operations, backups, and the ability to recuperate. And the movement from prevention and response, which is important, I wouldn't put them aside, they're part of the strategy, into pre-positioning yourself, looking at assuming that you're going to be attacked and doing all the right things. It's basic stuff. Okay, having redundancy, running in more than one environment, having correct backups, being able to understand where your sensitive assets are, protect your sensitive assets, okay, that if you'll be attacked, the likelihood of them being breached are low, and if they are breached, they're encrypted. These basic things in terms of pre-positioning should be also moved to the front, and not just responding and preventing. And the third point would be training people. Most organizations assume their workforce know their stuff. For some reason, most people assume that you have kind of team, and your team knows their stuff. In reality, you have to educate your team. You have to make sure your team is updated. You have to take them and educate them. And this is a continuous process. You cannot assume that they know what's chat GPT-4. You cannot assume that they know what's Log4j. You cannot assume that they know what happened in GoDaddy. GoDaddy was attacked 3 times in 2 years, probably. Again, that's according to, I didn't make it up, but according to the reports, by probably the same attacker, which was there all the time and attacked them again and again. And I'm just quoting what was published. Again, I'm not making anything up. So these kinds of events, educating your team on what's happening and making them much more aware, this is something you can't assume they'll read at home at night. These elements are key elements. And of course, there's the infrastructure part, which is key. I personally believe that the cloud is the place to move to. I believe that the cloud was designed to deal with cyber threats. The cloud has the ability to add on the fly capabilities. And although it's much easier to duplicate and move data, it's much safer than on-prem environments. I can explain why if you want, okay? But for attackers, on-prem environments are much, much, much more vulnerable. And they're going to become much more vulnerable in the coming decade because most of the extreme talented workforce are flocking to the cloud.
Yeah, I think that moving to the cloud is something that, at least in the enterprise market, our customers, your customers, are already made the decision to make the move. The question is how fast, to which stack, and how to protect the move. And I think this is some of the offering coming from your company. CyberProof is an MDR company. We're very much focused on companies that are making that move and how we can protect. It requires a lot. It could take years, right, to make this shift. Yeah. Let me pause for a second. We got a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I want to respect the audience and try to address some of them. So we already answered, but let me read one of them. How well are private sector organizations protecting themselves from attack by nation states? I think, Asaf, you detailed a playbook or a few action items that the organization should take. Whether they're taking it or not, I can say, I mean, it's very hard to answer that specific question, but I can say that I can distinct between enterprises' readiness of enterprises based on the awareness of the CISO and support he gets from the board, the investment he makes in its team, his or her team, partners that they pick also dictate how well they are prepared, and also the industry. Regulators, we did not discuss at all the regulator because we only have 45 minutes, but regulators are taking a hard stance mostly on the financial sector. But we've seen only recently in the UK on the healthcare side how the government intervened and published policies and committed the hospitals that are in the UK and also in the US are constantly being attacked. Also in Israel, there was an incident a couple of years back in one of the Israeli hospitals. So this is in terms of the status today. So it's very hard to generalize, but I think these are the parameters to distinguish between readiness across different organizations. Following in the same question, are there any means of measuring how successful efforts, those efforts to mitigate take place? I want to say something, probably Asaf, you're aware of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. In CyberProof, we work a lot with that framework to help establish some sort of a heat map through the organization to understand how protected they are, what efforts they need to make. We spoke about prioritization. So this is a great tool, how to prioritize your resources. And also CyberProof tools enables to on an online method to update the heat map of MITRE ATT&CK. So this is the kind of methodology we use, but it would be great to hear your perspective on how organization can measure itself on how protected it is.
Yeah, this is a very complicated question because the metrics, when it comes to understand it's again, everything should be measured, and you should have KPIs to understand what's your situational position and posture. I'm not going to take a lot of time to answer this question because it's a model. You have to build a model, and a model is not something so simple to kind of in 2 words say it. But the part of the model is the culture, part of the model is the team and the workforce, part of the model is the training, part of the model of the infrastructure, And part of the model, when I say culture, I'm meaning about the ability and the openness to talk about things. In some organizations, they just do not talk about cyber activity. They hide it. When something happens, they look away, and they don't look it in the eyes, and they don't put it in the table. They're ashamed about it. And in reality, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Every organization is attacked and will be attacked. The second part is, for my, the parts which I will give a highest score in the model are parts which are doing with pre-positioning and recuperating from an attack. I mentioned it, but these elements of your, how hygienic is your environment in terms of data and kind of chaos when it comes to your data landscape, in terms of backups, in terms of redundancy. In the real world, when you have, I'm going to kind of say something which might sound terrible to some of you, but the real hardship comes when an organization is knocked out, when it can't run its operation. This is a nightmare for organizations, especially organizations who are kind of, I would say it's 90% of organizations who rely on the internet and on IT for their day-to-day revenue. After that, you'll have all the rest. All the rest might be nasty. You know, when you have leaks, when you have IP theft, when you have all these things might be nasty, but it's not the same. And really the kind of the core element, which will get the highest score in the model I will build, or the model I hold, is your, without going into nitty-gritty and details, is your ability to maintain resiliency, operations, and to recuperate.
These are great tips that require maybe another SOC Masterclass workshop that we will need to schedule with Howard. We're approaching the end of the session, and before we are getting into some concluding remarks, let's run another poll. I know Howard heard another one. Go ahead, Howard. Has your organization's security operations been impacted by the rising geopolitical tensions in the last year? And we have three options. We can only guess what will be picked. Let's wait a few seconds. Yep. Okay, we'll see the results in a moment. Somewhat impacted. Okay. I think that you mentioned that we're not always aware of the extent of the attack. Sometimes you are being attacked and you don't know that yet. Sometimes it's only been seeded and planted in your organization and you will see it down the road. So our assumption would be that most of our portfolio and customers and the market, the industry is being impacted. The question is when it will show up and what will be the extent of the effect and how do you prepare in advance. But we have only a few minutes of stuff. So I want to move, as I promised, to some optimistic, try to look at the optimistic side of that. 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting convention between the leaders, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Australia, and the Prime Minister of the UK. AUKUS, this is the name of the alliance of those three powers, Western powers, around nuclear-generated submarines. We also have another alliance that US is part of, the Quad, with Japan and Australia and India in the Indo-Pacific area to meet the Chinese challenge. So we're seeing a lot of alliances rise, and of course, the most prominent example is NATO, that revived itself through the war or the tensions with Russia around Ukraine. Do you foresee, based on your experience as the former head of 8200, working with Western allies and other agencies globally, do you foresee these kind of alliances take place more and more? Also on the cyber end? And before you answer that, let me complicate the question a little bit more. What we also saw over the past year is not only alliances rising between government agencies, but also interesting collaborations with big tech. We've seen Microsoft and Google sharing intelligence information with the Ukrainian leaders and other Western allies. So these kind of interesting cross collaborations between private and government and public sectors, how do you see that evolves in the next years based on your experience?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's a good one. Generally, I'll start from the private sector. 50, 60 years ago, 40 years ago, the leading force in tech innovation were states. You can look at NASA, you can look at some of the programs which kind of also kind of generated and created the internet during the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Most of the technological kind of transformation were backed and pushed by states. This has changed. Today, the tech private sector is leading innovation in the world. It's not just in the US, it's in all of the world. And some of these companies are even bigger and powerful than nation states, both in terms of capital, influence, and their global outreach, okay? They're in every spot of the world. Looking into the Ukraine, you know, you look at Starlink and some of the other private companies which were active, from the big ones, they were very active. So one key point here is to understand that the leading force is private sector. And what's interesting in private sector that most thriving and prosperous companies do want to position themselves in free, democratic, liberal states, or free states, which believe in the values that we in Israel believe, that you in the US or the other states in Europe and some in the Pacific believe in. They do not want to be in, so they're hosted in the state. The state is kind of an overarching kind of platform which hosts them, and the thing they share at the end of the day are the values, the core values, and a very, very similar and strong perception of markets and economy and capitalism. And this is extremely strong. This is an extremely strong driver. The combination of private sector, overarching states which are hosting them and providing them security and the ability to operate economically, and obviously the idea of basically gaining capital through open and free markets. In this sense, this club who will align according to these principles, at the end of the day, will win the battle. Will win the battle. Without going into detail, I don't want to be provocative in this conversation, but when you look at the kind of the superpowers in the world, ask yourself in what country personally you want to live, in what country you want to raise your kids, in what country you want to see your relatives in. And it's very clear in what country you want to be and in what kind of country you don't want to be. And this will win at the end of the day. And this creates an amazing force. And the idea of like-minded states, coalitions, all kinds of entangled corporations between private sector and public sector, both on the national level and the multinational level, this will define according to these principles and values. I believe that this is an extreme robust force which will win and will define kind of the landscape we're growing in. And this is the optimistic side about it. And we have to stay vigilant about it. There are a few things we have to make sure that do not happen. But this is my kind of projection from I led one of the leading intel agencies and cyber agencies in the world. So this is my perspective.
So we have to take up on that, Asaf. If you're saying there are good reasons to be optimistic, we must agree. I agree with your optimism and the trajectory that you set. I think it's a great way to wrap this session. And thank you. It was very interesting to hear your thoughts following some of the points we mentioned. And you went beyond cybersecurity into values, core values, democratic values, liberal values, and I think that should guide us while building our strategies, capacities, whether it's the state level or in the organizations that we lead and we serve as customers. So thank you, Asaf. Over to you, Howard.
Thank you.
Well, that was great. I really appreciate both your time. I know time is precious to all of us, and I think it was very valuable. Yeah, this is pretty much a wrap. We've finished our final session. So if just as a just to give everybody a sense of, we have a lot of material that we share. A large part of our what drives us here at CyberProof is knowledge sharing and thought leadership. And anyone that wants to visit our website, just go on the resources area. It's actually full of very relevant information. And of course, if you want to have any follow-up or any discussion with us, we'd be happy, of course, to speak with you. And until next time, thank you for joining us, and have a great day. Bye for now.